When a nurse stayed up nights to care for an elderly patient, the two formed an unlikely bond. The patient shared stories of his life, slowly and gradually revealing secrets he had never told anyone else. As their friendship deepened, the patient confided in the nurse about his hidden wealth, ultimately leaving her millions in his will. However, the nurse soon discovered that the money was tied to crimes that reached the highest levels of power. Now, she must decide how far she will go to make things right, grappling with the weight of her newfound fortune and the dark secrets it holds. Welcome back to Tales with Cekos. Today, this story is going to be exciting and engaging. I bet you wouldn't listen to a story like this before. Let me assure you that it will feel like a movie. And if you love it, then do write in the comments section. The hospital was quiet at night, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the labyrinthine corridors. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving behind only the skeleton crew tasked with keeping vigil over patients too fragile to face the darkness alone. Among them was Clara Bennett, a nurse in her early 30s whose compassion seemed boundless despite the exhaustion etched into her features. Clara had always been drawn to caregiving. It was more than a job. It was her calling. She found purpose in the small moments, holding a trembling hand, offering a reassuring smile, or simply sitting beside someone when words failed. But tonight felt different. There was an ache in the air, a heaviness that clung to her like a second skin. Her patient tonight was Mr. Henry Whitaker, an elderly man in the final stages of heart failure. He lay motionless in his bed, his frail body tethered to machines that beeped and whirred with mechanical precision. His chart indicated no family visits, no emergency contacts listed, just a solitary note stating he preferred not to discuss personal matters. Yet something about him tugged at Clara's heartstrings. Perhaps it was the way his eyes softened when she entered the room, even as his voice grew weaker with each passing day. "Another long night for you, huh?" Clara asked gently, adjusting the blankets around him. Her tone carried warmth, though fatigue lingered beneath the surface. Henry managed a faint smile, his lips barely moving. "You don't have to stay," he rasped. "I'm just waiting now." Clara shook her head firmly. "Not on my watch. Besides, I've got nowhere else to be." It wasn't entirely true. She did have responsibilities outside these walls. A cramped apartment shared with her teenage daughter, bills piling up faster than she could pay them, and dreams deferred indefinitely. But here, in this dimly lit room, none of that mattered. Here, she could focus on what truly counted, easing suffering, however fleeting. As the hours passed, Clara stayed by Henry's side, reading aloud from old novels, sharing stories of her own life, and occasionally pausing to listen to his fragmented memories. He spoke of a childhood spent exploring forests, a wife who had loved sunflowers, and a son he hadn't seen in decades. Each word carried a weight of regret, though he never elaborated on why their relationship had fractured. "You must miss him," Clara ventured softly one night, sensing the unspoken sorrow behind his words. Henry's gaze drifted toward the window, where moonlight spilled across the floor. "More than you know," he murmured. "But some bridges can't be rebuilt." Clara nodded silently, respecting the boundaries he'd set. Still, she couldn't help but wonder about the son who had abandoned such a kind soul. What kind of person could walk away from someone like Henry? By the third week of her nightly vigils, Clara began noticing subtle changes in Henry's demeanor. Though physically weaker, he seemed emotionally lighter, as if unburdening himself through conversation had granted him a measure of peace. One evening, as she adjusted his IV drip, he reached out and grasped her hand with surprising strength. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice clearer than it had been in days, "for staying, for listening, for treating me like I still matter." Tears pricked at the corners of Clara's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "Of course you matter," she replied, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Everyone deserves kindness, especially now." Henry studied her face for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "There's something I need to tell you. About my son." Clara hesitated, unsure whether to encourage him or let the moment pass. Before she could decide, the monitors beside them emitted a sharp alarm, signaling a sudden drop in Henry's vitals. Nurses rushed in, ushering Clara aside as they worked to stabilize him. By the time the crisis subsided, Henry had slipped into unconsciousness, his secret left unspoken. Over the next few days, Clara wrestled with guilt and curiosity. Had she pushed too hard? Should she have let him rest instead of prodding him to open old wounds? These questions haunted her as she continued her shifts, checking on Henry whenever possible. Though he remained unconscious, she refused to give up hope. Something told her he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Then, late one night, a stranger arrived at the hospital. Tall and impeccably dressed, he moved with an air of authority that commanded attention. When he approached the nurse's station, his piercing blue eyes scanned the room before landing on Clara. "I'm looking for Mr. Henry Whitaker," he said. His voice clipped, but tinged with urgency. "They told me downstairs he's here." Clara's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the son Henry had spoken of so wistfully? If so, why had he waited until now to appear? "He's stable but critical," Clara explained cautiously. "Are you family?" The man hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Yes, I'm his son, Daniel Whitaker." Clara extended her hand, introducing herself, but Daniel barely acknowledged the gesture. Instead, he strode past her, heading straight for Henry's room. As Clara followed, she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened with every step. Clearly, this reunion wasn't going to be easy. When they entered the room, Daniel froze, staring at his father's frail form. For a moment, vulnerability flickered across his face, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Turning to Clara, he demanded, "Why didn't anyone call me sooner?" "We didn't know how to reach you," Clara admitted, choosing her words carefully. He never mentioned having family. Daniel's expression hardened. Typical, always keeping people at arm's length. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "How bad is it?" Clara hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. "He's been declining steadily, but..." She paused, glancing at Henry. "He's fought harder than anyone expected, maybe because he knew someone cared." Daniel frowned, clearly unsettled by her comment. "And who exactly are you to him?" "I'm just his nurse," Clara replied simply. "But I think he trusts me." For a moment, Daniel studied her intently, as if searching for ulterior motives. Finding none, he nodded gruffly. "Keep me updated, I'll be back tomorrow." As he left, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Daniel Whitaker than met the eye. Little did she know, his arrival would change not only Henry's fate, but hers as well. Daniel Whitaker returned the next morning, his presence commanding attention even in the subdued atmosphere of the hospital. Dressed in a tailored suit that screamed wealth and authority, he carried himself with an air of impatience tempered by restraint. Clara watched him from a distance as he spoke quietly with the attending physician, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Whatever emotions churned beneath the surface were carefully concealed, a trait she suspected, honed over years of navigating high-stakes environments. When the doctor finished updating him, Daniel turned toward Clara, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "You're the one who's been taking care of my father," he stated, rather than asked, his tone neutral but probing. Clara nodded, stepping forward cautiously. "Yes, Mr. Whitaker. I've been overseeing his care during the night shifts." He studied her for a moment longer, as though assessing her sincerity. Then, unexpectedly, he softened slightly. "Thank you for staying with him. It means a lot." The gratitude in his voice caught Clara off guard. She had expected arrogance or indifference, not vulnerability. "It's my job," she replied modestly. "But honestly, your father is easy to care for. He's kind, thoughtful." "He's stubborn," Daniel interrupted, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Always has been." Clara chuckled softly, sensing a glimpse of the man behind the polished exterior. "Well, maybe a little." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken history hanging between them. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat, shifting back into business mode. "Can I see him now?" "Of course," Clara said, gesturing toward Henry's room. "He's resting, but he might respond if you speak to him." As Daniel entered the room, Clara lingered just outside, watching through the partially open door. He approached the bed slowly, his movements deliberate yet hesitant. When he reached Henry's side, he hesitated before placing a hand lightly on his father's shoulder. "Dad," Daniel began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's me. I'm here." Henry stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering. For a moment, it seemed as though he might wake, but then he settled back into stillness. Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. The frustration was evident, but so was the pain. Clara stepped inside, offering a reassuring smile. Sometimes hearing familiar voices helps, she said gently, even if they don't respond right away. Daniel nodded, though his jaw remained clenched. How long does he have? It's hard to say, Clara admitted. His condition is critical, but every patient responds differently. All we can do is keep him comfortable and hope for the best. Daniel absorbed this information silently, his mind clearly racing. After a few moments, he straightened, regaining his composure. I'll need to make arrangements. Let me know if anything changes. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway, turning back to Clara. One more thing. You mentioned last night that he trusted you. What did you mean by that? Clara hesitated, unsure how much to share. Your father and I talked a lot during the nights I stayed with him. He shared stories about his life, his memories, and sometimes his regrets. I think talking helped him find some peace. Daniel's expression darkened, guilt flickering across his features. Regrets, huh? Figures he'd saved those for strangers. His words hung heavily in the air, revealing a rift far deeper than Clara had imagined. Before she could respond, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Over the next few days, Daniel became a regular fixture at the hospital. Though his visits were brief, they were frequent, each one marked by a mix of duty and unresolved tension. Clara observed him from afar, noting the subtle changes in his demeanor. Beneath the polished veneer of success lay a man grappling with regret, anger, and perhaps even love. For all his aloofness, it was clear he cared deeply for his father. One evening, as Clara prepared to leave after another long shift, Daniel intercepted her in the hallway. Do you have a minute? He asked, his tone unusually tentative. Surprised, Clara nodded. Of course. What's on your mind? He glanced around to ensure they were alone before speaking. I've been thinking about what you said, that my father found peace talking to you. Did he ever mention me? Clara hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. He spoke about you often, she admitted finally. With pride, mostly, but there was sadness too. Like he wanted to reconnect but didn't know how. Daniel flinched visibly, the admission hitting its mark. And you think that's why he stayed silent? Because of me? I don't know the full story, Clara replied honestly, but I do know people hold on to grudges because they don't want to feel vulnerable. Maybe both of you felt that way. For a moment, Daniel looked as though he might argue, but instead he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You're probably right. God knows I've spent years convincing myself I didn't need him. Turns out I was wrong. Clara offered a small smile, sensing a breakthrough. It's never too late to try. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting toward Henry's room. Maybe, but first I need to understand why things fell apart in the first place. That night, as Clara reviewed Henry's chart, she noticed something unusual tucked inside the folder. A handwritten letter addressed to Daniel. Curious, she debated whether to read it, but ultimately decided against it. Instead, she placed it aside, intending to give it to Daniel during his next visit. When he arrived the following morning, Clara handed him the envelope. I found this in your father's file, she explained. I think it's meant for you. Daniel stared at the letter, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Henry's shaky handwriting. My dear Daniel, I don't expect forgiveness, nor do I deserve it, but please know that I've spent every day since you left wishing I'd done better, as a father, as a man. You were always my greatest achievement, even when I failed to show it. If there's any chance to mend what's broken between us, I beg you to take it. Not for me, but for yourself. With all my heart, Dad. Tears welled in Daniel's eyes as he read the note, his composure cracking under the weight of emotion. Without a word, he turned and hurried into Henry's room, clutching the letter tightly. Clara followed discreetly, watching from the doorway as Daniel knelt beside his father's bed. Dad, he whispered hoarsely, gripping Henry's hand. I'm sorry. I should have come back sooner. Though unconscious, Henry's fingers twitched faintly in response, as if reaching out one final time. In that moment, Clara realized the true power of her role, not just as a caregiver, but as a bridge connecting hearts, separated by time and pain. And as she stepped back to give Daniel privacy, she knew their lives would never be the same again. The days that followed Daniel's emotional reunion with his father were a blur of quiet moments and unspoken reconciliation. Though Henry remained unconscious, the atmosphere in his room shifted palpably. Daniel visited daily, often staying for hours at a time. He spoke softly to his father, sharing stories from his own life, his successes, his failures, and the void left by their estrangement. Clara observed these interactions from afar, her heart swelling with hope. It was as if Daniel had finally allowed himself to be vulnerable, shedding the armor he'd worn for so long. But beneath the surface of this fragile piece lay secrets waiting to unravel. One evening, as Clara prepared to leave after another grueling shift, Daniel approached her with an expression she hadn't seen before, a mix of gratitude and unease. "Can we talk?" he asked, gesturing toward an empty lounge nearby. Curious, Clara nodded and followed him inside. Once seated, Daniel hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. Finally, he spoke. "I owe you an explanation," he began, his voice low but steady, "about why I stayed away all these years." Clara leaned back slightly, surprised by the admission. "You don't owe me anything," she replied gently, "but if you want to share, I'm here." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated. My father wasn't always the man you see now. When I was younger, he worked tirelessly to provide for us, but it came at a cost. He was distant, preoccupied, and sometimes cruel, not physically, but emotionally. By the time I graduated college, I couldn't stand being around him anymore. So I left, determined to make my own way." Clara listened intently, her empathy growing with each word. "That must have been hard, for both of you." "It was," Daniel admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But what I didn't realize until recently is how much of his behavior stemmed from fear. Fear of losing everything he'd worked for. Fear of failing as a provider. And maybe, fear of failing as a father." His vulnerability caught Clara off guard. She had assumed Daniel's wealth and success shielded him from pain, yet here he was, bearing his soul like anyone else. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked cautiously. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Daniel said firmly. "And because my family's past is about to collide with your present." Before Clara could respond, Daniel reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder filled with documents. As he slid them across the table, Clara's eyes widened in shock. Bank statements, property deeds, investment portfolios. It was clear that Daniel Whitaker wasn't just wealthy, he was extraordinarily rich. But what truly stunned her was the name listed on several accounts. Clara Bennett. "I don't understand," Clara stammered, flipping through the papers. This can't be right." "It is," Daniel confirmed, his tone grave. "When my father realized how much you've done for him, for us, he decided to repay you in the only way he knew how. He transferred a significant portion of his estate into a trust fund under your name. I found the paperwork while reviewing his finances." Clara's mind reeled, struggling to process the revelation. "But I didn't do anything special. I was just doing my job." "You did more than that," Daniel countered, his voice softening. "You gave him dignity in his final days. You reminded him, and me, that kindness matters more than money ever could. This isn't charity, Clara. It's gratitude." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as the weight of his words sank in. For years, she had struggled to make ends meet, juggling long shifts and mounting bills while raising her teenage daughter alone. Now, in an instant, her entire world had changed. Yet instead of relief, she felt conflicted. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she whispered, clutching the documents tightly. "I never asked for any of it." "That's exactly why you deserve it," Daniel replied earnestly. "You've spent your life giving without expecting anything in return. Let this be your chance to breathe, to focus on yourself and your daughter for once." Though his words resonated deeply, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that accepting such generosity would alter not only her circumstances, but also her identity. Who was she if not someone who worked tirelessly to survive? Could she embrace a new chapter without losing sight of who she truly was? As news of the inheritance spread among the hospital staff, whispers followed Clara wherever she went. Some congratulated her warmly, while others eyed her with thinly veiled envy. The attention made her uncomfortable, reinforcing her reluctance to accept the gift outright. Still, she couldn't deny the immediate impact it had on her life. Bills were paid, her apartment repaired, and her daughter enrolled in extracurricular activities she'd only dreamed of before. Yet despite these blessings, Clara found herself haunted by guilt. Was she betraying her principles by benefiting from Henry's generosity? Or was refusing the gift equally selfish, denying the legacy of kindness he had intended to leave behind? Her internal conflict came to a head one night during a particularly difficult shift. A young mother arrived at the ER with her critically ill child, frantic and uninsured. Without hesitation, Clara arranged for emergency care, covering the initial costs out of her own pocket, a gesture made possible by Henry's trust fund. Watching the mother's tears of gratitude, Clara realized something profound. Wealth wasn't inherently corrupting. It was simply a tool, one that could perpetuate harm or amplify good, depending on how it was wielded. From that moment on, Clara resolved to honor Henry's memory by using his gift responsibly. She established a scholarship fund for aspiring nurses, donated anonymously to struggling families, and even spearheaded a community health initiative aimed at underserved populations. Each act of generosity brought her closer to understanding the true value of what she'd been given, not as a reward, but as a responsibility. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to visit his father regularly, though their conversations grew fewer as Henry's condition worsened. One evening, as Daniel sat beside him, holding his frail hand, Henry stirred faintly, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. "Daniel," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I'm here, Dad," Daniel replied, leaning closer. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back." Henry's gaze softened, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "No regrets," he whispered, before slipping back into stillness. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he pressed his forehead against his father's hand. Though Henry passed away peacefully later that night, his presence lingered, not just in Daniel's heart, but in the lives he had touched through Clara. In the weeks that followed, Clara and Daniel formed an unlikely friendship, united by their shared connection to Henry. Together, they honored his legacy, ensuring that his final acts of kindness rippled outward, transforming countless lives, including their own. But as Clara embraced her newfound purpose, she couldn't shake the feeling that fate had orchestrated their meeting for reasons beyond redemption. Little did she know, the story was far from over, and the greatest twist was yet to come. Clara's life had transformed in ways she never imagined. With the trust fund Henry left her, she was no longer tethered to the relentless grind of night shifts and endless overtime. Instead, she poured her energy into community initiatives, using her newfound resources to uplift others. Her daughter Lily flourished under the stability their changed circumstances provided, excelling in school and pursuing passions Clara once thought were out of reach. Yet despite the outward success, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something about this inheritance didn't sit quite right. It wasn't greed or guilt, it was curiosity. Why would Henry Whitaker, a man who lived modestly and seemed disconnected from material wealth, leave such an extraordinary sum to someone he barely knew? Clara had accepted Daniel's explanation at face value, believing it stemmed from gratitude for her care during his final days. But as weeks turned into months, subtle inconsistencies began to surface, details that hinted at a deeper motive. The first clue came when Clara received a letter from a law firm she'd never heard of. Inside was a formal request to attend a meeting regarding additional provisions tied to Henry's estate. Confused but intrigued, Clara agreed to meet with the attorneys the following week. When she arrived at their sleek downtown office, she was greeted by a middle-aged lawyer named Mr. Grayson, whose demeanor was polite but guarded. "Ms. Bennett," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "Thank you for coming. We're here today to discuss certain arrangements your benefactor made prior to his passing." Clara frowned, leaning forward slightly. "Arrangements? I thought everything was settled with the trust fund." Grayson hesitated, glancing down at the folder in front of him. "The trust fund is only part of the picture. Mr. Whitaker also established a series of directives designed to safeguard his assets and ensure they were used responsibly." "What kind of directives?" Clara asked, her unease growing. Grayson opened the folder and slid a document across the table. It was a detailed plan outlining how the funds should be allocated, including specific instructions for charitable contributions, educational scholarships, and even political lobbying efforts aimed at healthcare reform. While noble in intent, the level of micromanagement struck Clara as unusual. "Why go to such lengths?" she pressed, scanning the pages. "This feels more like a mission than a gift." Grayson nodded slowly, as if expecting her reaction. "That's because it is. Your benefactor believed strongly in systemic change, but he also understood the risks involved. Which brings me to the second matter we need to address." He paused, studying her carefully before continuing. Mr. Whitaker anticipated potential opposition to his plans. To mitigate those risks, he entrusted key individuals, including yourself, with safeguards meant to protect his vision. Unfortunately, not everyone shares his ideals. Clara's pulse quickened. What are you saying? I'm saying, Grayson replied gravely, that you may become a target. People with vested interests in maintaining the status quo will stop at nothing to undermine these efforts. You'll need to proceed cautiously. Before Clara could respond, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. Excusing herself, she stepped outside to take the call. On the other end was Daniel, his voice tense and urgent. We need to talk, he said, without preamble. Meet me at my office immediately. When Clara arrived at Daniel's corporate headquarters, a gleaming skyscraper that dominated the city skyline, she found him pacing anxiously in his corner office. Papers were scattered across his desk, and the blinds were drawn, casting the room in shadow. What's going on? Clara asked, closing the door behind her. Daniel turned to face her, his expression grim. I've uncovered something disturbing about my father's estate, something I think you need to know. He handed her a file containing documents similar to those Grayson had shown her, but with one critical difference. These revealed that Henry's fortune wasn't merely personal savings. It was tied to investments in industries directly linked to corruption and exploitation. Pharmaceutical monopolies, predatory lending practices, environmental destruction. The list went on. My father spent decades amassing this wealth, Daniel explained, his voice heavy with regret. But near the end of his life, he realized the harm it caused. That's why he created the trust fund, to redirect those resources toward positive change. He wanted to make amends. Clara stared at the papers, her mind racing. So what does this mean for us, for the projects we've started? It means we're playing with fire, Daniel admitted. Some of these companies won't take kindly to losing control of their assets. They'll fight back, and they won't pull punches. As if on cue, the intercom buzzed, startling them both. Daniel pressed the button, his assistant's voice crackling through the speaker. Mr. Whitaker, there's someone here to see you. They say it's urgent. Send them in, Daniel instructed, exchanging a wary glance with Clara. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 40s, impeccably dressed and carrying an air of authority. She introduced herself as Rachel Monroe, an investigative journalist specializing in exposing corporate malfeasance. I've been tracking your father's dealings for years, Rachel said bluntly, addressing Daniel. And I believe you're sitting on a powder keg. Daniel frowned, gesturing for her to elaborate. What do you mean? Rachel pulled out a USB drive and placed it on the desk. This contains evidence implicating several major corporations in illegal activities, all connected to your father's investments. If released, it could dismantle entire industries, but releasing it also puts anyone associated with the information in grave danger. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Are you suggesting we expose this? I'm suggesting you have a choice to make, Rachel replied evenly. Stay silent and let the system continue unchecked, or step into the spotlight and risk everything to bring it down. For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. If Henry trusted me enough to give me this responsibility, then I owe it to him and to myself to see it through, whatever the cost. Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. Then we do this together. Over the next several weeks, Clara, Daniel, and Rachel worked tirelessly to prepare for the release of the evidence. They encrypted files, coordinated with whistleblowers, and reached out to allies within the media and government. Each step carried immense risk, but Clara drew strength from the knowledge that she was honoring Henry's legacy, not just as a benefactor, but as a catalyst for change. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than expected. As they prepared to upload the data to secure servers, a team of armed men stormed Daniel's office, their faces obscured by masks. Before anyone could react, Rachel activated a hidden panic button, triggering alarms throughout the building. Run, she shouted, shoving the USB drive into Clara's hands. In the chaos that followed, Clara and Daniel escaped through a service elevator, narrowly avoiding capture. Though shaken, they refused to surrender the evidence, knowing its power to transform lives, if it reached the right people. By dawn, the story exploded online, sparking outrage and calls for accountability worldwide. Corporations crumbled, investigations launched, and justice finally seemed within reach. For Clara, the victory was bittersweet. She had lost so much along the way, her anonymity, her sense of safety, but gained something far greater: purpose. As she stood beside Daniel, watching the sunrise over a city forever changed, Clara realized that fate hadn't brought her to Henry Whitaker by chance. It had chosen her because she was ready, not just to receive, but to give back in ways that mattered most. The aftermath of the exposé was nothing short of seismic. Headlines blared across every major news outlet, detailing the web of corruption uncovered by Clara, Daniel, and Rachel. Corporations once thought untouchable crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny, their executives arrested or forced into hiding. Politicians who had turned a blind eye to unethical practices scrambled to distance themselves, while grassroots movements sprang up overnight, demanding systemic reform. For Clara, the whirlwind of attention was overwhelming. She went from being an anonymous nurse working night shifts to a reluctant public figure thrust into the spotlight. Journalists camped outside her modest apartment, eager for soundbites about her role in dismantling one of the largest corporate scandals in history. Social media exploded with hashtags like #NurseHero and #KindnessMatters, painting her as a symbol of hope and resilience. Yet despite the adulation, Clara remained grounded, refusing to let fame overshadow the real work that still needed to be done. Daniel, too, faced his own reckoning. As the heir to Henry's fortune, and now its steward, he found himself at the center of both praise and criticism. Some hailed him as a visionary, willing to sacrifice privilege for justice. Others accused him of opportunism, claiming he only acted after realizing the extent of his father's misdeeds. But Daniel didn't care about the opinions of strangers. What mattered most was honoring Henry's final wish and ensuring that the wealth amassed through exploitation would never again harm those it was meant to serve. Rachel, meanwhile, became a household name, celebrated as the fearless journalist who had exposed the truth. Her career skyrocketed, but she remained steadfast in her mission, using her platform to amplify marginalized voices and hold power accountable. Though their paths diverged after the initial storm, Clara, Daniel, and Rachel stayed connected, united by the bond forged during their fight against injustice. Yet even as progress unfolded, shadows lingered. The consortium, a shadowy organization revealed in the documents, wasn't entirely dismantled. Its tendrils stretched far beyond individual corporations, embedding themselves in governments, law enforcement, and global markets. While many of its members faced consequences, others slipped through the cracks, retreating into the darkness to regroup. Clara knew better than to believe the battle was over. This wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about creating systems resilient enough to resist it. One evening, weeks after the dust began to settle, Clara sat alone in her living room, staring at the USB drive Rachel had entrusted to her. It represented more than evidence. It symbolized the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and the determination to build something better. As she turned it over in her hands, she reflected on how much her life had changed since meeting Henry Whitaker. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Expecting another reporter, Clara sighed and opened it cautiously. To her surprise, she found Daniel standing there, holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I figured you could use some company," he said, with a faint smile, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Clara chuckled softly, closing the door behind him. "You're not wrong." They settled onto the couch, the silence between them comfortable rather than awkward. After pouring the wine, Daniel raised his glass in a toast. "To my father," he said simply, "and to you, for finishing what he started." Clara clinked her glass against his, tears welling in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, or Rachel. We all played our part." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip before setting his glass aside. "Do you ever wonder why fate brought us together? Why your kindness toward a dying man set off such a chain reaction?" "All the time," Clara admitted, her gaze drifting toward the USB drive on the coffee table. "But I think the answer is simple. Kindness isn't just an act. It's a ripple. Sometimes it changes lives in ways we can't predict." Daniel smiled, leaning back against the cushions. "That sounds like something my dad would say." They spent the rest of the evening reminiscing about Henry, sharing stories that painted a fuller picture of the man they had come to admire. Through laughter and tears, Clara realized that Henry's legacy wasn't confined to money or revelations. It lived on in the connections he inspired and the lives he touched. In the months that followed, Clara dedicated herself to building a foundation in Henry's name. Focused on healthcare access, education, and environmental sustainability, The Henry Whitaker Foundation quickly gained traction, attracting donors and volunteers eager to contribute to meaningful change. Clara worked tirelessly alongside Daniel, who used his business acumen to ensure transparency and accountability within the organization. Together, they transformed Henry's vision into reality, proving that wealth wielded responsibly could be a force for good. Lily, Clara's daughter, thrived under the stability this new chapter provided. With access to opportunities she'd only dreamed of before, she excelled academically and discovered a passion for social justice. Watching her grow into a compassionate, driven young woman filled Clara with pride and renewed purpose. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to grapple with the complexities of his inheritance. Though he donated significant portions of his wealth to charitable causes, he also invested in startups focused on ethical innovation, determined to rewrite the narrative surrounding privilege. Slowly but surely, he rebuilt his relationship with Clara, their shared experiences forging a friendship neither had anticipated but both cherished deeply. One crisp autumn afternoon, Clara returned to the hospital where it all began. Walking through the familiar corridors, she felt a pang of nostalgia mixed with gratitude. So much had changed since those long nights spent comforting Henry, but the core of who she was remained the same. Compassion, she realized, wasn't something external. It was woven into the fabric of her being. As she approached the nurse's station, she spotted a young woman struggling to comfort an elderly patient. Without hesitation, Clara stepped forward, offering assistance with the same warmth and empathy that had defined her career. The young nurse looked up, relief washing over her face. "Thank you," she said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without someone like you." Clara smiled, recognizing the sentiment. We all need help sometimes. That's what makes us human. Later that evening, as she left the hospital, Clara paused to watch the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. Henry's legacy lived on, not just in the foundation bearing his name, but in the countless lives touched by acts of kindness sparked by his final gift. And as Clara walked away, she carried with her the unwavering belief that even the smallest gestures could create ripples capable of changing the world.